Following chronicles the start of an epic mountain bike trip across the Alps completed in July 2001, one of the more memorable adventures in my life. I was living with my wife and kids near Frankfurt, Germany in the early 2000s and working for one of the car companies there. At the time, I had a dime store mountain bike that got a lot of use biking around the local mountain, Feldberg, and along the Rhine River with my wife and 3 teenage kids. They liked it about as much as you can imagine teenage kids like anything their dad wants them to do. And so I was highly encouraged to continue mountain biking at my own pace and on my own time. I had biked on the trails of southeast Michigan a little bit and had been on a couple of multi-day road bike trips. And I was also a marathon runner. So when a German co-worker buddy of mine started talking about the possibility of biking over the Alps, it seemed like something in the realm of possibility. Although since I had flown over the Alps and had the experience to look down at uncrossable peaks, maybe I should have known better. My buddy's nickname is JD, which he named himself after he became an exchange student in Portland, Oregon, and realized that Americans had a collective inability to pronounce his given name no matter how many times they tried. He took me on a few bike rides on weekends through the trails around Frankfurt, along with a couple of other guys, Matthias and Ralph, whose actual names were a little easier to pronounce. I didn't realize it at the time, but the rides were actually an interview for me to see if I was going to be good enough to keep up with the crew he was assembling for the Alps crossing. Matthias had already crossed the Alps on a bike, so he was the leader by default. Well, that, and he was also the best biker. Ralph was also a hardcore biker and had every gadget that had ever been invented to ease the burden of biking. Everything, I think, except a motor, and it's possible he had that too. The other 2 crew members were JD's high school buddy with a competitive spirit named Jan, who seemed intent on beating JD on bikes any chance he got, and a tall, perpetually smiling American named Gary that had worked an expat assignment in Germany like me, but was now living back in the States. Since Gary was the only other American on the trip besides me, we shared several common disadvantages, not the least of which were poor language skills, inadequate cultural upbringing, and insufficient training at high altitude. Since Lance Armstrong was still a mythological figure at the time, we felt an obligation to try to avoid embarrassing the American reputation for biking skills. Unfortunately, I'm not sure we fully succeeded at that. As we got ready for the trip, we prepared in various ways. Gary foreshadowed his position in the biking order when he kept sending email messages across the Atlantic, asking if the rest of us were really training, and if so, how much. And then he'd finish with some statement about how he was just getting over the flu. Gary's messages provoked our de facto leader, Matthias, to regularly send us motivational emails about how much we should be training. I would always read them diligently, silently nod in agreement with the advice, but then subsequently fail to heed it. Anyway, I must have passed the interview process because the next thing I knew, JD was strongly encouraging me to buy a better bike, one with shocks on it. He and Matthias acted as my interpreters and advisors at a local bike shop. They each instructed me on, and I immediately forgot, all the German names to bike parts. I was a little intimidated as they point to a part and say, "What's the English name for this?" And I didn't even know the English name, let alone the German one. That alone could have been a clue that I might be a little bit over my head. Matthias and JD described some of the details of the trip for me, but I'm sure I just listened with a glazed look in my eye. Apparently, we would bike with herds of cattle, cross snowy passes at 8,500 feet, carry our bikes through man-made military trails carved along steep cliffs, and sleep in huts in remote areas of the Alps. All of that seemed very abstract to me, until, of course, I experienced it personally. I'd never had a bike with clips or with shocks before, and so I decided I would try out my new bike on local trails before we left for our Alps crossing. On the first outing, I fell about 6 times, banging my shin and other body parts in celebration, and only made it about halfway up my normal trek. That was a little disheartening, but I convinced myself it was just beginner's luck and I would get better. I went back a second and third time to the store, and the owner talked me into buying Gore-Tex everything. I laid it all out on the floor the night before our trip just to see if I had everything I would need. Even though it was extra weight, I threw in a toothbrush and deodorant. I tried to picture what I would need, but then go light as possible. Most of my weight, I think, was in carrying all the different currencies that I potentially might need. For this reason alone, I was sure many more people would be capable of crossing the Alps on bikes once the euro was implemented. We congregated at the Gruber Bike Hotel near Oberstdorf, Germany, at the very southern tip, on a Wednesday evening. I rode down with JD and Matthias. Ralph drove his company van down to our destination spot in Mals, Italy, and Jan drove down to collect him and bring him back to our meeting spot. Gary and his traveling companion took a taxi from the train station, having flown in from the U.S. The bike hotel was empty, except for us, so there wasn't much to do except sit and watch JD pack and repack and decide what to bring and what to leave behind. He would ask me my opinion, but then totally disregard it. That sort of thing is fun for a while, but eventually it starts to wear on you. "Should I bring this?" he asked, holding up baby powder. "Only if you let me take a picture of you holding it so I can send it to our coworkers." He decided not to risk the picture, so Jan modeled it instead. It's too bad it's called baby powder. For the exact same stuff but had a name like manly biking powder, then there would be no trouble bringing it along on the trip. Somewhere in the packing, he offered me a pair of sweats, which I finally agreed to take and was ultimately glad I did. I had forgotten that we would get off our bikes from time to time to eat and sleep. He also offered me things that weren't very useful, and I probably added 3 kilograms to my overall pack because of him. I also remembered I needed to account for the water I would have to carry, and I suddenly realized my pack weight was well beyond the reasonable target I was shooting for. I had images flash before my eyes of this overstuffed pack on this tiny little American biker bouncing up and down on unproven shocks and breaking his back somewhere in a remote section of the Alps. The hostess opened the kitchen just for us and made wonderful plates of spaghetti for dinner. We caught up on various stories, drank Weiss beer, and looked at maps, trying to imagine the ups and downs of the peaks and valleys. We basically were just killing time, waiting around to be tired enough to fall asleep so we could get up and start our epic journey. Finally, the hostess either gave us dirty looks or else went and put her pajamas on, but I think we finally got the signal and headed for bed. Thanks for listening to this intro. I'll publish the rest of the story in the near future.